The full moon loomed high above the treetops, casting its silver light upon the dense expanse of the whispering pines. The forest, usually alive with the rustling of nocturnal creatures, held an unnatural stillness. Kael stood at the edge of the pack's den, his amber eyes fixed on the glowing orb that controlled his fate. His breath misted in the cold night air, each exhale laced with dread. Tonight, the curse would come for him once more. A sharp shiver crawled down his spine as the first wave of pain struck. It started as a slow ache, deep in his bones, before twisting into something unbearable. Kael clenched his jaw, his claws digging into the earth as his powerful limbs began to convulse. He knew the pain well, it was the same agony he had suffered through every full moon since he was a pup. No matter how many times he endured it, it never became easier. His body rebelled against its own nature. Muscles tore and reformed, his fur retreated, and his once mighty frame crumbled into something smaller, weaker. His ears, sharp enough to detect the fluttering wings of an owl in his wolf form, dulled as they shrank into human shape. His muzzle shortened, his powerful fangs retracting into dull, flat teeth. His once magnificent coat of silver-gray fur disappeared, leaving behind only bare, vulnerable skin. He collapsed onto the cold ground, gasping for breath. Every inch of him trembled. The transformation always left him disoriented, his senses muted, his strength stolen. He felt exposed, as though the entire world could see him for the wretched thing he was. The forest seemed to whisper around him, the wind rustling through the trees like voices carrying judgment. His pack was nearby, their warm bodies nestled together in the safety of the den. If they saw him like this, they would never understand. Wolves were meant to be strong, untamed, free. But he was a mockery of their kind. Footsteps crunched against the leaves. Kael stiffened, his heart hammering against his ribs. Someone was coming. With the last of his strength, he forced himself to his feet, staggering toward the shadows of the trees. He could not let them see him. He could not let them know. Kael crouched in the undergrowth, his human form hidden beneath the thick foliage. He listened intently, his weakened ears straining to catch the sound of whoever approached. The scent reached him first, wood smoke, iron, and something bitter. Human. His stomach twisted. The presence of humans this deep into the forest was uncommon. The pack had always kept to the most isolated regions, away from the dangers of civilization. But lately, the scent of men had been growing stronger. They were venturing too close. Through the trees, Kael spotted them, 3 men, each clad in dark clothing, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They moved cautiously, scanning their surroundings with sharp eyes. One of them knelt by the riverbank, his fingers brushing against the snapped remains of a steel trap. Blood stained the earth around it, the scent fresh. "They got one," the man muttered, touching the red-streaked metal. "Not enough," another grunted. He was older, his face weathered by time and battle. "We need to catch the beast itself." Kael's breath caught. Beast. His pack. Or, him. The third man, younger and more impatient, scowled. "How do you even know it's real? This could just be a big wolf." The older man shook his head. "No. The stories are true. There's something different about the wolves in these woods. We've lost too many men not to take it seriously." Kael's fingers curled into fists. He knew, deep in his gut, that they were hunting him. His secret had not gone unnoticed. The hunters weren't after his pack, they were after the creature that became something else under the full moon. Him. His heart pounded as he watched them plant more traps, their hands steady, their voices low. If his pack stumbled into one of these snares, it would mean bloodshed. And Rygar, their alpha, would not let such an act go unpunished. War was on the horizon. Kael remained hidden until the humans disappeared into the distance, their voices fading with the wind. Only then did he allow himself to move, his bare feet silent against the damp earth. The moment the first rays of dawn touched the treetops, the transformation began again, his body aching as his wolf form reclaimed him. By the time he returned to the den, his fur once again cloaking his frame, he was met with wary eyes. "Where were you?" Rygar's voice was gruff, his golden eyes piercing. Kael hesitated. "Scouting. There are traps by the river." Rygar snarled, his hackles rising. "Then the time has come. We will not allow humans to trespass any longer." Kael's stomach turned. The war had begun before he could stop it. The pack gathered under the moonlight, their eyes burning with fury. The news of the hunters had spread quickly. Rygar stood at the center, his massive form radiating power. "We will show them what it means to threaten our kind," he growled. "No more hiding. No more retreating. We are wolves. We fight." A chorus of howls erupted in agreement. Kael remained silent, his mind spinning. If the pack attacked the hunters, they would only provoke more. The humans would retaliate, and the war would never end. But if he revealed his secret, if he told them that he understood the humans better than they thought, would they listen? Or would they turn on him? His curse had always been a burden. But now, it was a weapon. He could use his human form to infiltrate, to gather information, to find another way. If only he had the courage to tell them the truth. A voice broke through his thoughts. "We should strike before they strike us," growled Varric, one of the pack's fiercest warriors. "End them before they set another trap." Others nodded in agreement, but Kael saw the fear in their eyes. They had lost too many already. "What if there's another way?" Kael asked, his voice measured but firm. Rygar's gaze snapped to him. "Another way?" Kael took a deep breath. "If we attack them now, more will come. But if we understand them, what they truly want, we might find a way to stop this without war." A low murmur spread through the pack. Suspicion. Doubt. "And how do you suggest we do that?" Rygar asked coldly. Kael hesitated. 3 days. That's all he had until the full moon would force him back into human form. If he told them now, they might cast him out. But if he did nothing, the war would begin. His heart pounded. He looked at his pack, his family. The only home he had ever known. If he was to protect them, he had to take a risk greater than any before. "I need time," Kael said finally, his voice laced with quiet urgency. "Let me find a way before we doom ourselves to endless bloodshed." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Rygar's golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You have 3 days," he said. "After that, we fight." Kael swallowed hard. 3 days to change fate. 3 days before the blood moon rose again. Kael had never ventured beyond the borders of the forest in his human form. The thought of walking among humans, speaking their tongue, pretending to be one of them, it was as unnatural to him as the transformation itself. But now, as he made his way toward the edge of the whispering pines, he knew he had no choice. Dressed in stolen clothes, a simple shirt and trousers he had taken from a deserted hunting cabin, Kael felt exposed. His senses were dulled in this form, his movements clumsier. He could not smell as sharply, nor hear as keenly. He was weaker. And yet, for the first time, he was about to use this weakness as a weapon. As he approached the small village nestled beyond the river, he kept his head down. The scent of human life overwhelmed him, smoke from chimneys, the tang of metal, the musk of livestock. He saw them, men and women bustling about, their conversations a blur of sound. He had seen them from afar, but never this close. His first step into the village felt like stepping into another world. He needed information. He needed to understand what the hunters knew, what they feared. And, more importantly, how he could stop them before they struck the pack first. As he moved through the dirt roads, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "You there?" You look lost. Kael turned sharply. A young woman stood before him, her piercing blue eyes studying him with quiet curiosity. She was human, but something about her gaze unsettled him. She was too perceptive. He hesitated, forcing himself to remember how humans spoke. I'm looking for work. The woman raised an eyebrow but didn't press. You might want to try the tavern. People always need an extra set of hands. Kael nodded, murmuring a quiet thanks before turning away. But as he walked, he felt her gaze linger on him. He was running out of time. He had to find out what the humans were planning before the blood moon rose again. The tavern smelled of ale and wood smoke, the air thick with the low murmur of conversation. Kael kept his head down as he slipped inside, his keen eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. He needed to be careful. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and the hunters would recognize him for what he was. He made his way to a dimly lit corner and sat, his muscles tense beneath his borrowed clothes. From across the room, he saw the older hunter, the one who had spoken of the wolves. The man sat with two others, their voices hushed but urgent. They're growing bolder, the hunter muttered, fingers drumming against the wooden table. We found more tracks near the village this morning. It's only a matter of time before they attack. Kael's jaw clenched. Lies. His pack had never once threatened the humans unless provoked. And yet, fear was a powerful weapon. If these men truly believed the wolves were a danger, they would not stop until the forest ran red. He listened intently, catching snippets of their conversation. Alpha's moving soon, another hunter said. We need to be ready. Kael's blood ran cold. Alpha. Were they talking about Rygar? Or, was there another force at play? His thoughts were interrupted when the woman from earlier approached. You look like you've got a lot on your mind, she said, her blue eyes watching him too closely. Kael forced a small smile. Just tired. She didn't seem convinced. People around here don't trust strangers. Neither do wolves, he thought. Before he could respond, the tavern door slammed open. A young boy ran inside, his face pale with terror. There's been an attack. By the river. Kael's breath caught. He knew, without a doubt, that the war had begun. Kael's pulse thundered in his ears as he shoved his way through the crowded tavern. The boy's frantic cries still rang in the air, filling the room with a suffocating tension. Every patron had gone silent, eyes darting to one another in hushed speculation. Kael barely took a breath before he stepped out into the night, his instinct screaming at him to run, to find out what had happened by the river. The village was eerily quiet despite the looming fear. Torchlight flickered against the wooden houses, the scent of burning oil filling the air. He reached the outskirts within minutes, his legs carrying him faster than they should have in this fragile human form. Then he saw it. The riverbank was streaked with blood. Deep claw marks raked across the dirt, and broken branches told of a vicious struggle. The scent of his own kind clung to the wind, but it was overpowered by the copper tang of death. Kael knelt, his fingers brushing against the churned-up earth. His chest tightened. A body lay in the reeds. Heart hammering, Kael approached cautiously. He rolled the figure onto its back, and a choked sound escaped him. It was one of their own. A young scout from the pack, barely of age, his throat torn open. A growl built in Kael's throat, raw and uncontained. This wasn't just a warning. This was a declaration of war. A rustling in the brush made him snap his head up. He wasn't alone. Shadows moved between the trees. A single gleam of metal caught the moonlight. A hunter. Watching. Waiting. Kael's breath came ragged and sharp. His human body ached, fragile and useless in a moment that demanded power. His wolf instincts screamed at him to fight, but his form was a prison, weak and bound by the laws of men. He took a slow step back, eyes never leaving the darkness where the hunter lurked. Then, a voice cut through the night. "Step away from the body." Kael's jaw tightened. The voice was deep, steady. It belonged to someone who had killed before. The hunter's silhouette became clearer as he moved forward, torchlight glinting off a silver blade strapped to his belt. Silver, deadly to his kind. Kael swallowed his rage. He could not fight, not like this. His only choice was to retreat, but he knew the hunter wouldn't let him go easily. A footstep, then another, slow and measured. "I said, step away." Kael took another step back, his mind racing. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, the scent of blood thick in his nose. He had to make a choice, run and risk leading the hunter back to the pack, or stand his ground and reveal himself. The decision was made for him when the hunter lunged. Kael barely dodged in time, rolling over the damp earth as the hunter swung his blade. He scrambled to his feet, his breath sharp, his limbs aching. The hunter was fast, too fast for a normal man. Kael's mind reeled, this wasn't just an ordinary human. Then, the hunter spoke again, voice laced with quiet menace. "I know what you are." Kael's stomach dropped. He had been found out. The world around him seemed to shrink. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to let the beast within him loose, but he couldn't, not yet. Not here. He turned and bolted into the woods, his bare feet pounding against the earth. Branches slashed at his skin, but he pushed forward, heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, the hunter gave chase. The night was no longer his ally. The hunt had begun. Kael's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself forward through the dense undergrowth. The hunter's presence loomed behind him, relentless in pursuit. The moon's pale glow barely reached through the thick canopy, casting long shadows that danced like specters in the night. Every step felt like a battle against his own weakened body, his human form betraying him when he needed his strength the most. The sound of snapping branches echoed behind him, closer than before. Kael cursed under his breath, his mind racing. He could not fight, not like this. He needed to escape, to reach the pack before it was too late. A sharp pain exploded in his side. The force of the impact sent him sprawling onto the cold earth. Dazed, he struggled to push himself up, but his limbs felt sluggish, unresponsive. A warm trickle of blood seeped through his torn shirt where the hunter's blade had grazed him. Boots crunched against the ground. The hunter was above him now, towering like an executioner ready to deliver the final blow. "Not so fast, wolf," the hunter murmured, his voice filled with quiet menace. "You run well for a cursed one, but you should know, there's no escaping me." Kael gritted his teeth, his body coiled with desperation. He could feel the shift lurking just beneath his skin, the raw energy of his true form clawing to be free. But he could not transform. Not yet. Not with the silver so close. The hunter crouched, pressing the edge of his dagger against Kael's throat. The cold bite of the metal sent a shudder through his body, and for the first time, Kael felt true fear. "I know what you are," the hunter continued. "And I know what you've been hiding from them." Kael's breath hitched. His mind spun. How did this hunter know? Had someone betrayed him? Had the pack already begun to turn against him? Then, the hunter smirked, and Kael understood. The bastard was toying with him. A snarl tore from Kael's throat. He lashed out, knocking the dagger aside with what little strength remained in his limbs. Rolling to his feet, he braced himself, fists clenched. The hunter only chuckled, wiping the blood from his lip where Kael's strike had landed. "You've got fight in you," the man mused. "Good. It'll make this more fun." Kael didn't wait. He lunged, his human body moving with all the agility he could muster. The hunter was fast, but Kael was faster. He ducked beneath another swing of the dagger, his muscles screaming in protest. He needed to get away, he needed time. But the hunter anticipated his movement, catching his wrist and twisting it with brutal force. A sharp crack echoed in the night. Kael bit back a cry of pain as his arm wrenched unnaturally. He fell to his knees, vision blurring. The hunter loomed over him, triumphant. "You are not as strong as you think you are," the hunter said, voice dripping with satisfaction. "Your kind, your pack, they will fall like the others. And when they do, I will be there to watch." Something inside Kael snapped. His vision darkened at the edges, his breath deepened, his pulse slowed to a steady, dangerous rhythm. The pain in his body faded, replaced by something ancient, something primal. The air crackled around him. The hunter hesitated, sensing the shift. Kael lifted his head, his amber eyes glowing in the moonlight. A slow, feral grin spread across his face as he whispered, "Then you don't know what I am at all." The transformation struck like lightning. His bones snapped, his muscles stretched, and his skin gave way to fur. The agony that usually consumed him was gone, replaced by raw, unbridled fury. He had no time to think, only to act. The hunter barely had time to scream before the wolf was upon him. The metallic tang of blood filled Kael's mouth as he tore into the hunter's flesh. His senses roared to life, sharper and more vivid than ever before. The man's screams echoed through the darkened forest, but Kael barely heard them over the thunderous pounding of his own heart. He was no longer just a wolf. He was something more, something deeper, darker, untamed. The moment stretched, an eternity suspended in violence. The hunter's body convulsed beneath his powerful jaws, the fight draining from him like water slipping through fingers. And yet, even in his dying moments, the man's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "You think, you've won," the hunter wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. "But this is only the beginning." Kael hesitated, his teeth still buried in the man's shoulder. The words sent a ripple of unease through him. Before he could question further, the hunter's body sagged, his breath fading into silence. Dead. Kael stepped back, panting, his massive form looming over the corpse. The rush of battle began to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. His golden eyes flickered over the man's body, searching for answers, something, anything that could explain the hunter's final words. A glint of metal caught his eye. Around the hunter's neck, half hidden beneath the torn fabric of his cloak, was a medallion. Kael shifted back, his blood-stained claws reaching for it. The silver burned his fingers, but he gritted his teeth and pulled it free. The symbol etched into the surface sent ice through his veins. It was the mark of the Order of Aurelian, the most ruthless faction of hunters in existence. And if one of them had been hunting him, it meant more would come. Kael's stomach twisted. He could not fight an entire faction alone. His pack, they had to know. They had to be prepared. A howl split the night, distant but unmistakable. Kael's ears pricked up. It was from the den. Something was wrong. With a final glance at the fallen hunter, he turned and bolted through the forest, his paws pounding against the earth. The wind howled around him, whipping through his fur as he raced toward home. As he neared the den, the scent of fear hit him like a physical blow. His pack, his family, were in danger. Bursting into the clearing, Kael's heart clenched at the sight before him. The den had been breached. Wolves lay scattered, wounded or motionless, their bodies bathed in the cruel light of the full moon. The scent of blood and silver hung thick in the air. And in the center of the chaos, a towering figure stood, his silver-plated armor gleaming under the night sky. Kael skidded to a halt, his hackles raised. The man before him was no ordinary hunter. He was a sentinel. A high-ranking enforcer of the order. The sentinel turned slowly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Kael's. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. At last, the man said, "The cursed wolf returns." Kael's muscles coiled, every instinct screaming at him to attack, to fight, to tear this man apart for what he had done to his pack. But something in the sentinel's gaze gave him pause. "I know what you are, Kael," the sentinel continued, his voice calm, measured. "And I know what you carry inside you." Kael's breath hitched. How did this man know his name? How did he know about the curse? The sentinel took a step forward, and Kael tensed, ready to lunge. "But tell me," the man said, his voice like a blade slicing through the night, "do you?" Kael's heart thundered in his chest as he stood face to face with the sentinel, his golden eyes locked onto the hunter's steely blue gaze. Around them, the clearing reeked of blood, fear, and something more insidious, defeat. His pack lay broken, some stirring with painful groans, others too still, their fates uncertain. He wanted to charge, to sink his fangs into the man who had orchestrated this attack, but something in the sentinel's smirk held him back. "You don't know, do you?" The sentinel's voice was laced with a cruel amusement. "You fight so hard for them, for your kind, yet you don't even understand what you are." Kael bared his teeth, a low growl vibrating through his chest. "I am a wolf of the Moonfang pack. That's all I need to know." The sentinel tilted his head, a gloved hand tightening around the hilt of a silver dagger at his waist. "Then why does the moon not rule you?" Kael faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The sentinel noticed. "You shift when the full moon wanes, not when it rises," the man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You carry a curse that binds you between two worlds, neither wolf nor man." Kael's breath came faster now. He had lived with his affliction all his life, but the words still cut deep. He knew he was different, that he did not change as his brethren did, but never had it been put into words so precisely, so coldly. He fought to steady himself, to ignore the gnawing truth that the sentinel was unearthing. "I was born this way," Kael said finally, his voice quieter but firm. "I am what I am." The sentinel chuckled, shaking his head. "No, boy. You were made this way." Something inside Kael twisted violently. Made? What did that mean? Before he could demand answers, a pained whimper from behind him yanked his attention away. His sister, Leora, lay curled on the ground, her silver-streaked fur matted with blood. A sharp pang of protectiveness surged through him, overriding the confusion that the sentinel had stirred. He would not let any more of his pack suffer. With a snarl, he lunged. The sentinel was fast, faster than any hunter Kael had ever faced. He sidestepped smoothly, the silver dagger flashing in his hand. Kael twisted midair, narrowly avoiding a lethal slice, but pain flared as the blade grazed his shoulder. Silver burned like fire in his veins, but he did not falter. He landed on all fours and lunged again, his fangs snapping inches from the sentinel's throat. The man twisted away, driving a boot into Kael's ribs and sending him sprawling across the blood-stained earth. Kael groaned, his ribs aching from the impact. The sentinel advanced slowly, dagger glinting, a predator savoring his prey. "This is your fate, Kael," the sentinel said, his voice almost pitying. "You cannot escape it." Kael refused to accept that. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to his feet. He wasn't done. Not yet. But before either of them could move, a piercing howl shattered the night. It was not from his pack. It was something else. Something ancient. Kael's blood ran cold as the sound reverberated through the trees, shaking the very ground beneath them. The sentinel froze, his confident smirk fading into something far more uncertain. Kael didn't know what was coming. But he knew one thing. It had come for him. The eerie howl lingered in the air, vibrating through Kael's bones like an unspoken prophecy. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, and for the first time that night, even the sentinel hesitated. The powerful hunter, who moments ago had spoken with unwavering confidence, now stood rigid, his gaze shifting beyond Kael, into the depths of the trees. Kael could feel it too, an unseen force pressing against his mind, stirring something within him that he didn't understand. His body tensed as instinct battled confusion. Whatever this was, it had power beyond anything he had faced before. Then, the underbrush parted. A massive wolf emerged from the shadows, its fur silver as moonlight, its eyes glowing like molten amber. It was larger than any wolf Kael had ever seen, its presence exuding an authority that sent shivers through him. The sentinel exhaled sharply. "No, it's impossible." Kael turned his gaze to the hunter. "What is it?" But before the sentinel could answer, the wolf spoke. Not with words, but with a voice inside Kael's head. "You do not know what you are, but you will. Come with me, child of the blood moon." Kael's breath hitched. This creature, it knew him. And more than that, it could communicate beyond mere growls and snarls. He stole a glance at his wounded packmates, at Leora, her breathing shallow. His duty was to them. But something about this wolf, the way it looked at him, the weight of its presence, pulled at him like the call of the moon. The sentinel took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "You're not taking him." The silver wolf's gaze flicked to the hunter. A low, rumbling growl filled the air, vibrating through Kael's chest. The very trees seemed to tremble at the sound. "You have no power over what is destined." The voice in Kael's mind deepened, resonating with something buried deep in his soul. "Come, Kael. Or be lost forever." Kael's heart pounded. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stay, to fight for his pack, for the life he had always known. And yet, that life had never truly belonged to him. He had always been different. Always been searching. Was this what he had been waiting for? A single choice stood before him. The path he took would change everything. Kael's paws hesitated on the forest floor, his mind in turmoil. The silver wolf's glowing eyes bore into him, its silent demand pressing on his spirit. Behind him, the sentinel remained poised, blade at the ready, watching, waiting, for Kael's next move. His pack lay broken and bleeding, and yet something inside him whispered that this stranger, this massive beast, carried answers he had sought his entire life. "Come." The silver wolf's voice rang within his skull like a chime in the wind. "Learn the truth before it is too late." Kael clenched his jaw, torn between duty and the unknown. Then, without another word, he turned and followed the silver wolf into the trees. A guttural growl erupted from the sentinel, but he did not give chase. "This isn't over, Kael," he called. "You can't run from the truth forever." Kael ignored him, his heart pounding as he disappeared into the darkness of the ancient woods. They ran in silence, the towering trees swallowing them whole. The deeper they ventured, the stronger Kael's senses became, his hearing sharpened, his vision more attuned to the shadows around him. Something about this place felt different, as though the very air hummed with forgotten power. After what felt like hours, they reached a glade where moonlight bathed the land in a silver glow. The silver wolf stopped and turned to face him. "You have always wondered what you are," the voice spoke into Kael's mind again. "Tonight, you begin to understand." Kael took a step forward. "Who are you?" The wolf's form shimmered, the air around it distorting like heat over flames. Then, before Kael's eyes, the great beast shifted into something else entirely, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with long silver hair and the same molten amber eyes. Kael's breath caught. "You're like me." The man gave a slow nod. "And yet, you are unlike any of us." Kael narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" The stranger exhaled, stepping closer. "You bear the mark of the blood moon, a curse and a gift. Unlike others, you are bound to two worlds, never belonging to either. You are not just a wolf, nor just a man." His gaze darkened. "You were made this way." Kael's body stiffened. He had heard those words before. The sentinel had said the same thing. His stomach twisted as realization dawned. "What am I?" The man studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You are the last of the Eldrin lineage, the lost bloodline that was thought to have perished centuries ago. Kael's head spun. The Eldrin? He had heard the name in old stories, tales whispered among wolves about a forgotten race of shapeshifters with abilities beyond comprehension. They had been hunted to extinction by men who feared their power. But that was just a myth. Or so he had thought. If that's true, then why am I alive? Kael demanded, his voice unsteady. Why was I never told? The man's expression darkened. Because someone didn't want you to know. Someone who feared what you might become. Kael felt a chill creep up his spine. He thought of the sentinel, of the way the hunter had looked at him, not just with hatred, but with knowledge. He knew. A weight settled in Kael's chest as he realized the truth, his entire life had been a lie. And now, standing in the glow of the blood moon, he had to decide what to do with the truth. Kael's breath was shallow as the weight of the revelation settled upon him. The Eldrin lineage, an ancient bloodline thought to be extinct, flowed through his veins. He wasn't just an anomaly, cursed by the blood moon. He was something more, something dangerous. The silver-haired man watched him closely, as if reading the conflict churning inside him. You must understand, Kael. Those who feared the Eldrin did not stop hunting them just because they believed the bloodline was gone. If they learn you exist. Kael clenched his fists. Then I become the hunted. The man nodded. The sentinel knows. He's known for longer than you think. A sharp pang twisted in Kael's gut. The sentinel had always been relentless, but now Kael saw the truth, he hadn't just been hunting wolves. He had been hunting him. I need to go back, Kael said suddenly, his voice firm. My pack is still in danger. The man's expression darkened. If you go back now, you will bring death with you. Kael's jaw tensed. They need me. They need you to be ready. The man took a step closer, his amber eyes glowing with intensity. If you return as you are now, you will not survive the war that is coming. And neither will they. A shiver ran down Kael's spine. A war? Who are you? Kael asked, his voice quieter this time. You know so much about me, about what's coming, but I don't even know your name. The man studied him for a moment, then exhaled. I am known as Theron. I was once part of a pack, like you. But when I learned what I was, I had to make a choice, stay and let them suffer because of me, or leave and find the truth. Now, I offer you the same choice. Kael swallowed hard. You want me to leave them? I want you to survive, Theron corrected. And to do that, you must understand your power, your history. You must awaken what has been hidden inside you. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, in the distance, a wolf's cry echoed through the night, low, mournful, filled with pain. Leora. Kael's heart clenched. His pack was still suffering. He had promised to protect them. And yet, Theron's words hung heavy in his mind. If he rushed back unprepared, would he only lead them to ruin? He had never felt so lost. Theron placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip strong but steady. The choice is yours, Kael. But you must make it soon. The storm is coming. Kael looked up at the moon, its crimson glow bathing the land in eerie light. His fate had never been his own. Until now. And he had to decide what to do with it. Kael's decision weighed on him like an iron chain, but in the end, he knew he had no choice. If he wanted to protect his pack, he needed to understand what he truly was. He turned to Theron, his fists clenched. Teach me. A flicker of approval passed through Theron's amber eyes. Then we begin now. Without warning, Theron lunged. Kael barely had time to react before a powerful force slammed into him, knocking the breath from his lungs. He tumbled backward into the dirt, the wind whipping through his hair as Theron loomed above him, his golden gaze piercing. Too slow, Theron growled. You rely too much on instinct. That will get you killed. Kael coughed, rolling onto his hands and knees. What was that? Theron stepped back, arms crossed. You're strong, Kael, but raw. You think like a wolf, fight like a wolf. But you are something more. The Eldrin were faster, stronger, and more attuned to the elements than any creature alive. And if you want to stand against the Sentinel and his forces, you need to unlock that power. Kael wiped dirt from his lip. And how do I do that? Theron studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. Stand up. Kael hesitated, then grasped his forearm and pulled himself to his feet. Theron nodded toward the forest. Come. They walked deeper into the woods, the night thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. After a while, they reached a clearing where the trees arched high above, their branches forming a natural dome. Theron turned to face him. We start with control. Kael frowned. Control. Theron's expression darkened. You think the blood moon only curses you once a month. But the truth is, it is always with you, always calling to the beast inside. Right now, it controls you. You must learn to command it. Kael swallowed hard. And how do I do that? Theron smirked. By pushing you to your limits. Before Kael could respond, Theron raised his hand, and suddenly, the air around Kael shifted. A force gripped him, an invisible weight pressing against his limbs, his chest, his very breath. His vision darkened at the edges as his heart pounded violently. What? Kael gasped, staggering. Theron's voice was calm. Feel it. Do not fight it. The blood moon is inside you, Kael. Let it guide you. Kael's instincts screamed at him to resist. He felt his wolf rising, his claws itching to emerge, his body trembling between forms. He had always fought against the transformation, always feared losing himself to the beast. But now, he let go. A rush of power flooded through him, searing and electric. His senses sharpened, his heartbeat thundered in his ears. For the first time, he did not just shift. He became. A savage growl erupted from his throat as he stood, not just as a wolf, not just as a man, but as something new. Theron smiled. Now, he murmured. You are ready to learn. Kael stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath uneven as the newfound power surged through him. He could feel it, the raw energy humming beneath his skin, the pulse of the blood moon now an ember within his chest rather than a suffocating force. Theron circled him, his golden eyes sharp with approval. Good. You're learning to embrace it. Kael clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. I feel different. Because you are, Theron said. The blood moon no longer binds you. You've taken the first step toward mastery. Kael exhaled sharply. And the next step? Theron gestured toward a nearby boulder, massive and unyielding. Move it. Kael blinked. Move it? Theron crossed his arms. With your power. Not your body. Kael hesitated, then took a step forward, planting his feet. He reached out with his senses, feeling the earth beneath him, the wind in the trees, the stone's heavy presence. He willed it to move. Nothing happened. Theron sighed. You're thinking like a human. Again. Kael growled, frustration rising. Then how am I supposed to think? Like the Eldrin, Theron said. Like a force of nature, untethered by doubt. Kael clenched his jaw. He closed his eyes, shutting out his uncertainty. He reached deeper, beyond his thoughts, beyond his hesitation. The power was there, waiting. He pulled it forward. A sudden surge of heat radiated from his core, his skin prickling as if flames danced beneath the surface. The ground trembled faintly. Then, with a sharp exhale, he thrust his hands forward. The boulder moved. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was enough. Kael's eyes snapped open, shock flashing across his face. He had done it. He had reached out and touched the world with his power. Theron gave a rare nod of satisfaction. Better. Kael panted, his pulse racing. This is insane. Theron smirked. It's only the beginning. The wind shifted, carrying with it a distant sound, howls, mournful and urgent. Kael stiffened. His pack. They were calling for him. His heart wrenched. Every second spent here was a second they fought alone. He turned to Theron. I have to go back. Theron's expression darkened. You are not ready. I don't have a choice, Kael snapped. They need me. Theron studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Then prove it. Before Kael could ask what he meant, Theron lunged again, faster than before. Kael barely had time to react before Theron's fist struck toward him. But this time, Kael dodged. Not out of instinct, but with purpose. Theron grinned. Now you're getting it. Kael's breath came fast, his muscles tense. He could feel the fire inside him growing, but it wasn't overwhelming him, it was his to control now. For the first time, he felt ready to fight. And for the first time, he believed he might win. Kael sprinted through the forest, his body moving with a newfound ease, his senses sharper than ever before. The energy coursing through his veins no longer felt foreign, it was his, a part of him as natural as breath. The training with Theron had unlocked something deep within him, and now, with every stride, he felt the weight of his purpose settle into place. The howls of his pack rang in his ears, an urgent summons laced with fear. He pushed himself harder, leaping over roots and fallen branches with an agility he never knew he had. The scent of blood tainted the air. His heart clenched. When he finally emerged into the clearing near the pack's den, the sight before him sent a chill down his spine. Wolves, his family, were wounded, some barely standing, others struggling to breathe. The air reeked of silver and gunpowder. Humans. Hunters. They had attacked again. A low, menacing growl rose in Kael's throat as his gaze darted across the battlefield. His mother, Leora, stood in the center, her silver fur matted with blood. Eldrick, his father, stood beside her, panting, his powerful frame still imposing despite his injuries. Kael didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside one of the fallen wolves, his friend Dane. Dane's breathing was shallow, his amber eyes barely open. Kael, he rasped. You're back. I'm here, Kael said firmly, pressing a hand against Dane's wound. Stay with me. Leora turned, relief flashing in her weary gaze. Kael. Before she could finish, a sharp whistle cut through the night. The remaining wolves tensed as the scent of more intruders filled the air. The hunters weren't finished. Kael rose to his feet, his body thrumming with the power he had only just begun to understand. He would not let them take any more from him. He had spent too long running from what he was, too long fighting against his own nature. Not anymore. He turned to Eldrick. How many? Eldrick's golden eyes met his, filled with a mixture of pride and warning. At least a dozen. Armed. They'll be back any second. A dozen hunters. Silver bullets. Against a wounded pack. The old Kael would have felt fear. But now, he felt something else entirely. Rage. Kael flexed his fingers, feeling the energy stir within him, waiting to be unleashed. He turned to face the approaching threat, his heart pounding in unison with the howling wind. This time, he wouldn't run. This time, he would fight. The night was eerily silent for a brief moment, as if the forest itself held its breath in anticipation of the impending battle. Then, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, signs of approaching danger, shattered the quiet. The hunters were closing in. Kael's fingers curled into fists as he took a steadying breath. This was different from anything he had faced before. The training with Theron had prepared him for control, but this was war. Life or death. His pack's survival depended on him. Leora nudged his shoulder with her muzzle. "Kael, we fight together." He nodded, glancing at Eldrick, who was already shifting back into his wolf form, despite his injuries. His father was a warrior, and even wounded, he would not stand down. Then, the first shot rang through the trees. Kael moved without thinking, lunging toward the nearest hunter who had broken through the tree line. The man barely had time to raise his rifle before Kael was upon him. He knocked the weapon aside, a feral snarl ripping from his throat as he drove the man to the ground with supernatural strength. Around him, his pack fought with all they had. Wolves darted between the shadows, fangs bared, claws flashing under the moonlight. The scent of blood filled the air as hunter and wolf clashed in a brutal dance of survival. A sharp pain seared through Kael's shoulder. He gasped, staggering back as a silver-tipped dagger grazed his skin. A hunter, younger than the rest, had managed to land a blow. Kael turned to face him, his eyes blazing with fury. The hunter hesitated. Perhaps he hadn't expected Kael to look so human. Perhaps he had been told they were nothing but beasts. Kael took advantage of the moment's hesitation, striking fast. He grabbed the man by the wrist and twisted, forcing the dagger from his grip before shoving him away. More gunfire erupted. A wolf yelped in pain. Kael's heart clenched as he turned to see his friend, Riven, struggling to rise after a shot to the leg. Kael didn't think, he moved, closing the distance between them in seconds. He crouched low, extending his hands over Riven's wound, willing his energy forward. Heat surged through him, pouring into his friend. The wound began to close, flesh knitting itself back together at an unnatural speed. Riven gasped in shock, looking up at Kael with wide eyes. You healed me." Riven breathed. Kael barely had time to answer before another hunter charged at him, blade glinting in the moonlight. But this time, Kael was ready. He sidestepped smoothly, calling upon his newfound strength, and delivered a strike so powerful it sent the man tumbling backward. The battle raged on, but something was shifting. The pack fought with renewed strength, and Kael, no longer torn between his two worlds, fought with purpose. He was no longer just a wolf cursed to be human or a man lost among beasts. He was something else entirely. And he was winning. The battle waged on, but Kael felt the tide shifting in their favor. The hunters, once emboldened by their weapons and tactics, were now struggling to keep up with the pack's newfound unity. The scent of fear mingled with blood in the air, and for the first time, Kael saw uncertainty in their enemies' eyes. Then, a cry rang through the clearing. Kael turned just in time to see Leora falter, blood staining the thick silver fur along her side. His mother collapsed to the ground with a pained growl. Eldrick rushed to her, his snarl feral as he protected his mate, but Kael could see the tremble in his father's stance. Rage, cold and absolute, surged through Kael's veins. He had fought this battle to protect his pack, to ensure no more lives were lost, and yet here was his mother, struggling to rise, wounded because he had not been fast enough. A hunter loomed nearby, reloading his rifle, his focus locked on Leora. He was going to finish her. No. Kael moved with inhuman speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. His hand shot forward, seizing the barrel of the rifle and twisting it from the hunter's grasp. With a surge of strength, he slammed his opponent backward into a tree. The impact sent a crack rippling through the night, and the hunter slumped, unconscious. The remaining hunters saw the shift. Their advantage had been lost, their numbers dwindling. Some hesitated, stepping back toward the trees, their fear now outweighing their greed. Then, the leader of the hunters, a man with deep scars across his jaw and a cold, calculating gaze, raised his hand, signaling a retreat. "This isn't over," he snarled, locking eyes with Kael. "You're more than just a wolf now, aren't you?" Kael's chest heaved, his muscles tense with the urge to pursue, to finish this fight once and for all. But his gaze flickered back to his mother, to his wounded packmates, and he knew that securing their safety mattered more than vengeance. The hunters fled, vanishing into the forest, their footsteps swallowed by the wind. A tense silence settled over the battlefield. Kael dropped to his knees beside Leora, his hands hovering over her wound. He could feel his energy stirring, that strange, newfound ability to heal. He pressed his palms against her fur, and warmth flowed from him, knitting her wound together before his eyes. Her breathing steadied, and after a moment, her eyes fluttered open. "My son," she whispered. "You saved me." A lump formed in Kael's throat, but he swallowed it down. "Rest. We'll get you home." Eldric's gaze met Kael's, filled with something Kael had never seen before, pride. The pack, though bloodied and battered, had survived. But Kael knew this was only the beginning. The hunters would return, stronger, smarter. And the next time, he would have to be ready. Because he was no longer just a wolf, nor just a man. He was something more. The night was thick with the scent of blood and smoke. Though the hunters had fled, the echoes of their presence lingered in the shattered trees, the torn earth, and the wounded bodies of Kael's kin. The weight of what had transpired pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating. His hands still trembled from the battle, from the power that had coursed through him when he had healed his mother. It was a power he did not yet understand, and yet it had saved a life, her life. But even as relief settled over him, a darker realization gnawed at the edges of his mind: the hunters would return, and next time, they would be prepared for what he had become. Kael turned to Eldric, who was crouched beside Leora, his body a shield even in the aftermath. The Alpha's eyes lifted to meet his son's, a mixture of weariness and gratitude in his gaze. "We need to move," Eldric said, his voice rough. "Our wounded won't survive another attack if we remain here." Kael nodded. He knew his father was right, but something inside him still resisted the idea of retreat. The hunters had come for him. He had felt it in their stares, in the way their leader had spoken his name like a challenge. Running wouldn't keep them safe, not forever. "Where do we go?" one of the wolves asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. The pack was shaken, their confidence rattled. Eldric looked at Kael. It was subtle, but undeniable. A shift. An expectation. Kael swallowed hard. His father wasn't just asking for his opinion. He was testing him. "Are you ready to lead?" For a moment, Kael hesitated. He had spent his life being caught between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. But now, the path ahead was clear. He had to protect his pack. He had to embrace what he was, even if he did not fully understand it yet. "We head to the highlands," Kael said finally. "The caves there are defensible, and the terrain will make it harder for the hunters to track us." Murmurs rippled through the gathered wolves, some of them nodding in agreement. It was a good plan. The highlands were sacred ground, rarely tread upon, but in times of crisis, they had always served as a haven. Eldric studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Then we move before dawn." As the pack began to prepare for the journey, Kael felt a presence at his side. Leora, still weak but standing, rested a hand on his arm. "You did well tonight," she murmured. He turned to her, searching her face. "Did I? We lost too many. We barely made it." Her eyes softened. A leader doesn't measure victory in the absence of loss, but in the survival of those who remain. Her words settled deep inside him. He wanted to believe them, but doubt still lingered. He had faced his first real test, and though he had survived, the battle had only just begun. The hunters would not stop. And he could not afford to fail again. As the first light of dawn crept over the trees, Kael took a deep breath. He had always been caught between two worlds. But if he was going to lead his pack to safety, then he would have to forge a new path. A path that was his alone. The journey to the highlands began before the first rays of sunlight had fully touched the land. The pack moved as a shadowed force, silent despite their number, wounded but determined. The scent of blood still clung to them, a reminder of the battle that had left them fractured yet not broken. Kael walked at the front, his mind a storm of thoughts, the weight of leadership pressing heavier on his shoulders than he had ever imagined. Leora moved beside him, her steps careful but steady. Though she was still recovering, she refused to lag behind, her spirit unyielding despite the pain that lingered. "You need rest too," she murmured, catching Kael's sidelong glance at her. "There's no time," Kael said, voice taut. "The hunters won't give us that luxury." "They won't stop, Kael." Her words were soft but carried a truth he already knew. "You're not just running from them, you're leading us into a war." A war. The word echoed in his mind, sharpening the reality he had tried to suppress. The hunters wouldn't be content with their retreat, they would regroup, stronger and more determined. They had tasted the power of his kind, and they would not rest until they had driven them to extinction. As the pack neared the entrance of the highland caves, Eldrick raised his hand, signaling for a halt. "We'll rest here before moving deeper," he announced, his voice carrying authority despite the exhaustion in his expression. Kael turned to observe his pack. Some collapsed onto the rocky ground, breathing heavily, their wounds aching despite their supernatural healing. Others stood guard, their eyes flickering between the trees and the sky, as if expecting danger to descend upon them at any moment. "We can't stay long," Kael said, stepping beside his father. "We need to plan. The hunters will be back." Eldrick studied him, his gaze unreadable. "You've grown much in a short time," he said after a pause. "I see the burden you carry." Kael exhaled sharply. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this." "No leader ever is," Eldrick replied. "But you're not alone." Before Kael could respond, a sharp howl split the air, piercing through the silence like a blade. Every wolf turned, muscles tensed, eyes scanning the horizon. The howl was not one of their own. Kael's blood ran cold. The hunters weren't coming. They were already here. With a roar of urgency, Eldrick called out, "To the caves. Now." The pack moved swiftly, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Kael reached for Leora's hand, gripping it tightly as they sprinted toward the cavern entrance. The ground trembled beneath them, the distant sound of horses galloping in the distance, a telltale sign of the hunters' approach. They barely made it inside when the first arrows struck the earth where they had stood mere seconds before. Kael turned to see the shadows of their enemies breaking through the tree line, torches in hand, weapons gleaming under the early morning light. Trapped. For the first time, Kael realized there was no turning back. They would have to fight, and this time, it was a battle that none of them could afford to lose. The cavern walls trembled with the weight of their breathing. The pack was huddled within the highland caves, their golden eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight as they braced for the inevitable. The scent of damp stone mixed with the iron tang of blood that still clung to their fur. Outside, the sound of galloping hooves and the rustling of branches echoed through the night, hunters closing in. Kael's heart pounded as he peered through a narrow opening in the rock. Shadows moved between the trees. They weren't charging in recklessly this time. The hunters had learned. They were patient. They were methodical. And Kael knew that patience was deadlier than rage. Leora clutched his arm. "We can't stay trapped in here. They'll burn us out." She was right. The moment the hunters realized where they were, they wouldn't storm the caves, they would set fire to the entrance, let the smoke and heat do the work for them. Kael turned to Eldrick, his father's imposing form standing tall despite the exhaustion evident in his aging frame. "We have to strike first." Eldrick's gaze darkened. "We don't have the numbers to fight them head-on." Kael clenched his fists. Then we don't fight head-on. He turned to the pack, his voice firm, steady, but filled with an emotion that demanded their attention. We're not just wolves. We are hunters ourselves. We don't cower in shadows, we become them. We don't wait for death to claim us, we claim it first. A low growl of agreement rippled through the pack. Even those wounded and weary straightened, their eyes burning with a newfound determination. Eldrick nodded slowly. What's the plan? Kael exhaled. He didn't feel ready for this. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. But the blood moon was near, he could feel its pull in his bones, the curse and gift that set him apart from the others. We divide them, he said. A few of us will lure them deeper into the woods, make them think we're vulnerable. Once we draw them away from their numbers, we strike from the shadows. Hit fast. Hard. And what if they don't take the bait? Leora asked. Kael met her eyes, the weight of his decision settling in his chest. Then I'll make them. Silence fell over the pack. They understood what he meant. He would reveal himself. Show them what he was, both wolf and man. Eldrick's expression tightened, but he didn't object. He only rested a firm hand on Kael's shoulder. Be careful, son. Kael gave a small nod before shifting into his wolf form. His muscles stretched, his bones reshaping, his fur dark as the night itself. He sprinted into the trees, his movements silent as a whisper on the wind. The hunters would come. The blood moon would rise. And Kael would no longer run from his fate. He would embrace it. The forest was alive with whispers of the impending battle. Every branch, every gust of wind carried the scent of danger. Kael moved like a shadow between the trees, his paws silent against the damp earth. Behind him, Leora and 3 others followed, their breathing measured, their golden eyes glowing like embers in the night. The hunters were near. He could smell the scent of sweat and steel, the faint burn of oil-soaked torches carried by men who thought themselves masters of this land. They were speaking in hushed tones, strategizing, unaware of the predators watching them from the darkness. Kael lowered his body, signaling to the others. He could make out at least 8 men in this group, all armed. More would be scattered throughout the forest, waiting for the wolves to reveal themselves. They think we're the prey. A flicker of rage ignited in his chest. No more running. No more hiding. Kael let out a low, guttural growl, just loud enough to drift through the trees. A sound of warning, of challenge. The hunters went still. Did you hear that? One of them murmured. Another cursed under his breath. They're close. Kael took a step forward, making sure the light of their torches barely brushed his dark fur. Just enough to let them see. Just enough to let them follow. One hunter lifted his crossbow. There. I see one. Kael turned and ran. He didn't sprint at full speed, just fast enough to keep them on his trail. Behind him, he heard them shouting, their boots pounding against the forest floor. Perfect. Leora and the others scattered, moving in separate directions, flanking the hunters from the sides. They wouldn't attack yet, not until Kael led them deep enough, away from the others. The chase carried them through the thick of the forest, the trees growing denser, the shadows stretching longer. Kael's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the thrill of knowing they were exactly where he wanted them. Finally, he reached the clearing near the river's edge. The moonlight was brighter here, the perfect stage for what was to come. He stopped abruptly, turning to face his pursuers. The hunters skidded to a halt, torches raised, weapons pointed. Nowhere left to run, beast, one of them sneered. Kael's lips curled back into a snarl. But he didn't move. He simply stood there, watching. Waiting. Then the wind shifted. A howl split the night, sharp and piercing. Leora. It was the signal. A heartbeat later, the forest exploded. Leora and the others struck from the darkness, their fangs flashing, their claws tearing through cloth and armor. The hunters screamed, caught off guard as the ambush unfolded with brutal precision. Kael lunged at the leader, knocking the man to the ground before he had a chance to fire his crossbow. The hunter gasped, struggling, but Kael pressed a paw against his chest, his teeth inches from his throat. Please," the man rasped. "Mercy." Kael hesitated. And that hesitation almost cost him everything. A sharp pain tore through his side. An arrow. He let out a snarl of pain, staggering backward. One of the remaining hunters had fired while Kael was distracted. Leora roared in fury, leaping onto the man before he could fire again. The rest of the pack descended, finishing what they had started. Kael stumbled, his vision blurring for a moment as the pain radiated through his body. The world swayed, but strong hands, no, paws, were suddenly at his side. "Leora. You're hurt," she said breathlessly, her eyes wide with worry. Kael gritted his teeth. "I'll live." The clearing fell silent except for the ragged breaths of the wolves. The hunters lay motionless. The battle was won. But the war? Far from over. Kael glanced toward the sky. The blood moon was rising. And with it, his time was running out. The scent of blood was thick in the air, mingling with the damp earth and the burning wood from discarded torches. The battle in the clearing had ended, but the war raged on in Kael's mind. He stood amidst the fallen hunters, his breath heavy, his side aching from the arrow lodged deep into his flesh. His vision blurred for a moment, but he forced himself to stay upright. Leora was at his side in an instant, pressing a firm paw against his wound. "We need to get you back," she urged, her voice filled with concern. Kael clenched his teeth, shaking his head. "Not yet." He lifted his gaze to the sky, where the blood moon had begun to rise, bathing the forest in an eerie crimson glow. The cavern walls trembled with the weight of their breathing. The pack was huddled within the highland caves, their golden eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight as they braced for the inevitable. The scent of damp stone mixed with the iron tang of blood that still clung to their fur. Outside, the sound of galloping hooves and the rustling of branches echoed through the night, hunters closing in. Kael's heart pounded as he peered through a narrow opening in the rock. Shadows moved between the trees. They weren't charging in recklessly this time. The hunters had learned. They were patient. They were methodical. And Kael knew that patience was deadlier than rage. Leora clutched his arm. "We can't stay trapped in here. They'll burn us out." She was right. The moment the hunters realized where they were, they wouldn't storm the caves, they would set fire to the entrance, let the smoke and heat do the work for them. Kael turned to Eldrick, his father's imposing form standing tall despite the exhaustion evident in his aging frame. "We have to strike first." Eldrick's gaze darkened. "We don't have the numbers to fight them head-on." Kael clenched his fists. "Then we don't fight head-on." He turned to the pack, his voice firm, steady, but filled with an emotion that demanded their attention. "We're not just wolves. We are hunters ourselves. We don't cower in shadows, we become them. We don't wait for death to claim us, we claim it first." A low growl of agreement rippled through the pack. Even those wounded and weary straightened, their eyes burning with a newfound determination. Eldrick nodded slowly. "What's the plan?" Kael exhaled. He didn't feel ready for this. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. But the blood moon was near, he could feel its pull in his bones, the curse and gift that set him apart from the others. "We divide them," he said. "A few of us will lure them deeper into the woods, make them think we're vulnerable. Once we draw them away from their numbers, we strike from the shadows. Hit fast. Hard. And what if they don't take the bait?" Leora asked. Kael met her eyes, the weight of his decision settling in his chest. "Then I'll make them." Silence fell over the pack. They understood what he meant. He would reveal himself. Show them what he was, both wolf and man. Eldric's expression tightened, but he didn't object. He only rested a firm hand on Kael's shoulder. "Be careful, son." Kael gave a small nod before shifting into his wolf form. His muscles stretched, his bones reshaping, his fur dark as the night itself. He sprinted into the trees, his movements silent as a whisper on the wind. The hunters would come. The blood moon would rise. And Kael would no longer run from his fate. He would embrace it. The forest was alive with whispers of the impending battle. Every branch, every gust of wind carried the scent of danger. Kael moved like a shadow between the trees, his paws silent against the damp earth. Behind him, Leora and 3 others followed, their breathing measured, their golden eyes glowing like embers in the night. The hunters were near. He could smell the scent of sweat and steel, the faint burn of oil-soaked torches carried by men who thought themselves masters of this land. They were speaking in hushed tones, strategizing, unaware of the predators watching them from the darkness. Kael lowered his body, signaling to the others. He could make out at least 8 men in this group, all armed. More would be scattered throughout the forest, waiting for the wolves to reveal themselves. "They think we're the prey." A flicker of rage ignited in his chest. No more running. No more hiding. Kael let out a low, guttural growl, just loud enough to drift through the trees. A sound of warning, of challenge. The hunters went still. "Did you hear that?" one of them murmured. Another cursed under his breath. "They're close." Kael took a step forward, making sure the light of their torches barely brushed his dark fur. Just enough to let them see. Just enough to let them follow. One hunter lifted his crossbow. "There. I see one." Kael turned and ran. He didn't sprint at full speed, just fast enough to keep them on his trail. Behind him, he heard them shouting, their boots pounding against the forest floor. Perfect. Leora and the others scattered, moving in separate directions, flanking the hunters from the sides. They wouldn't attack yet, not until Kael led them deep enough, away from the others. The chase carried them through the thick of the forest, the trees growing denser, the shadows stretching longer. Kael's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the thrill of knowing they were exactly where he wanted them. Finally, he reached the clearing near the river's edge. The moonlight was brighter here, the perfect stage for what was to come. He stopped abruptly, turning to face his pursuers. The hunters skidded to a halt, torches raised, weapons pointed. "Nowhere left to run, beast," one of them sneered. Kael's lips curled back into a snarl. But he didn't move. He simply stood there, watching. Waiting. Then the wind shifted. A howl split the night, sharp and piercing. Leora. It was the signal. A heartbeat later, the forest exploded. Leora and the others struck from the darkness, their fangs flashing, their claws tearing through cloth and armor. The hunters screamed, caught off guard as the ambush unfolded with brutal precision. Kael lunged at the leader, knocking the man to the ground before he had a chance to fire his crossbow. The hunter gasped, struggling, but Kael pressed a paw against his chest, his teeth inches from his throat. Please," the man rasped. "Mercy." Kael hesitated. And that hesitation almost cost him everything. A sharp pain tore through his side. An arrow. He let out a snarl of pain, staggering backward. One of the remaining hunters had fired while Kael was distracted. Leora roared in fury, leaping onto the man before he could fire again. The rest of the pack descended, finishing what they had started. Kael stumbled, his vision blurring for a moment as the pain radiated through his body. The world swayed, but strong hands, no, paws, were suddenly at his side. "Leora. You're hurt," she said breathlessly, her eyes wide with worry. Kael gritted his teeth. I'll live. The clearing fell silent except for the ragged breaths of the wolves. The hunters lay motionless. The battle was won. But the war? Far from over. Kael glanced toward the sky. The blood moon was rising. And with it, his time was running out. The scent of blood was thick in the air, mingling with the damp earth and the burning wood from discarded torches. The battle in the clearing had ended, but the war raged on in Kael's mind. He stood amidst the fallen hunters, his breath heavy, his side aching from the arrow lodged deep into his flesh. His vision blurred for a moment, but he forced himself to stay upright. Leora was at his side in an instant, pressing a firm paw against his wound. "We need to get you back," she urged, her voice filled with concern. Kael clenched his teeth, shaking his head. Not yet. He lifted his gaze to the sky, where the blood moon had begun to rise, bathing the forest in an eerie crimson glow. Its pull was stronger than before, thrumming in his veins like an unshakable force. His curse was awakening. Eldrick and the rest of the pack emerged from the shadows, their golden eyes surveying the battlefield. Eldrick stepped forward, his face grim. "The others have fallen back, but this is far from over." Kael knew what his father meant. The hunters would regroup. They would come back stronger, more prepared. "We can't keep running," Kael said, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't just about survival anymore. We have to end this." A heavy silence followed. The pack exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them argued. They all knew the truth. The hunters would never stop. Eldrick nodded slowly. "Then we strike first." Kael exhaled, steadying himself despite the pain. "We have until dawn," he murmured, watching as the blood moon climbed higher. "And before then, I need to understand what I am." Leora frowned. "What are you talking about?" Kael turned to her, his eyes reflecting the crimson glow above them. "This curse, this gift, I need to control it. If I don't, I won't be able to protect any of you." Eldrick's expression darkened. "You don't have time to test your limits." "I don't have a choice," Kael countered. He felt it, pulsing within him, the power of the blood moon, the force that made him different from the rest of his pack. If he didn't embrace it now, it would consume him when the time came. Leora hesitated before stepping forward. "Then you won't face it alone." Kael's gaze softened as he met hers. He had always been prepared to fight his battles alone, but now, for the first time, he realized he didn't have to. Eldrick exhaled. "Then we move together." The pack gathered around Kael, forming a silent, unwavering circle of loyalty. Whatever was coming, they would face it as one. The blood moon loomed above them, its light carving shadows through the trees. And as Kael closed his eyes, letting its power flood through him, he knew. This was only the beginning. The blood moon loomed high above the treetops, its crimson glow sinking into Kael's skin like fire. Every pulse in his body roared with an energy he didn't understand, a force so raw and overwhelming that he could feel it clawing at the edges of his mind, demanding release. The pack stood around him, watching in silence. Their eyes held concern, but none of them spoke. They all knew what this moment meant. Leora stood closest, her gaze unwavering. "Kael," she murmured, "can you hear me?" He tried to answer, but the words stuck in his throat. The power was rising too fast. His body ached as if it were being torn apart, his bones shifting painfully between forms. This wasn't the smooth, controlled transformation of his usual shift. This was something else, something wild. Eldrick stepped forward. "Breathe, son. Control it. Control." That was the problem. This wasn't something he could simply contain. The blood moon had awakened something deeper, something ancient buried in his bloodline. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and Kael fell to his knees, his claws digging into the dirt. He let out a low, guttural growl as his muscles tensed, his vision flashing red. Leora rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. "Kael, listen to me," she urged, her hands gripping his arms. "You're stronger than this. You control the change, not the other way around." But it wasn't just about control. It was about acceptance. For years, he had feared the blood moon, cursed the nights it forced him into human form. But now he realized, it wasn't trying to weaken him. It was showing him something more. The duality of his nature. Wolf and man. Hunter and hunted. The power wasn't a curse. It was his birthright. Kael clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. Instead of fighting the transformation, he let it happen. His body burned, his skin rippling between forms, but he didn't resist. He surrendered, to the wolf, to the man, to everything in between. And then, suddenly, stillness. Kael stood, breathing heavily. But he was neither fully wolf nor fully man. His form was something in between, taller, more powerful, his limbs still furred, his claws extended, but his posture unmistakably human. The pack stared in stunned silence. Leora's eyes widened. "Kael," she whispered. Eldrick exhaled, his gaze unreadable. The legends were true. Kael flexed his fingers, staring at his own body. He had control. The power was his. The blood moon had given him a choice. A rustling sound broke the moment. The hunters. They had found them. Kael turned toward the shadows beyond the trees, his golden red eyes burning. For the first time, he felt no fear. No doubt. This was the battle he had been born to fight. And this time, he would end it. The forest stood still, as if even nature itself held its breath in anticipation of the battle to come. The scent of the hunters was thick in the air, sweat, steel, and smoke from the torches they carried. Kael could hear their hushed voices, their cautious footsteps pressing against the damp earth. They thought they were prepared. They had no idea what awaited them. Kael stood at the front of the pack, his new form towering over the others. He was neither man nor wolf, but something beyond them both. Strength coursed through his veins, his senses heightened to an almost unbearable level. Every heartbeat, every breath of the men approaching was laid bare before him. Leora stepped beside him, her eyes flickering with awe and concern. "Kael, what are you now?" He turned his gaze to her, his voice deeper, laced with an unshakable calm. "Exactly what I was meant to be." A soft growl rippled through the pack as they readied themselves. Eldrick watched his son carefully, nodding in silent approval. "They are nearly here," he murmured. "What's the plan?" Kael didn't hesitate. "We end this tonight. No more running." He turned to his pack. "Spread out, stay in the shadows. Strike only when I give the signal." The wolves disappeared into the undergrowth, becoming part of the forest itself. Only Leora and Eldrick remained at Kael's side as the hunters came into view. A dozen men emerged through the trees, their weapons gleaming under the blood moon's glow. The leader, a hardened man with silver threading his dark beard, held up a hand, signaling his men to stop. His sharp eyes landed on Kael, flickering with something between recognition and fear. "You," the man growled, tightening his grip on his sword. "I knew there was something different about you." Kael stepped forward, unafraid. "You came into our land, slaughtered my people, and for what? Fear." His voice was steady, but beneath it, there was something else, a challenge. The leader sneered. "We came to rid the world of your kind. Abominations that shouldn't exist." Kael's muscles tensed, but he didn't give in to rage. "Not yet. And yet, here I stand," he said calmly. "Stronger than ever." The hunter's eyes narrowed. He could sense it. The shift in power, the fact that Kael was no longer something he understood. Then, the man smirked. "Kill them all. The air erupted with movement. But the wolves were faster. Before the hunters could raise their weapons, the pack struck from the shadows. A man screamed as Eldrick lunged, his massive form knocking him to the ground. Leora weaved through the chaos, her fangs tearing through leather and flesh. The forest became a battlefield, the night filled with snarls and cries of agony. Kael, however, moved only toward one man, the leader. The hunter swung his sword, aiming for Kael's chest. But Kael dodged with inhuman speed, his claws catching the blade mid-swing. With a single, brutal motion, he shattered the steel between his fingers. The hunter staggered back, eyes wide. "What are you?" he whispered. Kael didn't answer. Instead, he struck. His claws tore through the man's armor as if it were paper, sending him crashing to the ground. Kael loomed over him, breath heavy, rage coiling through his veins. "Finish it," Eldrick's voice came from the distance. Kael hesitated, his heart pounding. He had spent his life fighting to prove he wasn't a monster. Killing this man would be justice. But was it who he wanted to be? The hunter coughed, blood staining his lips. "Do it," he rasped. "Prove you're nothing more than a beast." Kael's claws trembled. Then, with a slow exhale, he pulled back. "No," he said. "I'm not like you." The man's eyes widened, but before he could speak, Kael struck, hitting the hunter's temple just hard enough to knock him unconscious. The rest of the hunters were either dead or retreating. The battle was over. Kael turned to his pack. "We're done running," he said. "This is our land. And we will never bow to fear again." The wolves howled, their voices rising into the blood moon's glow. And for the first time in his life, Kael felt truly free. The echoes of howls still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of blood and smoke. The battlefield was quiet now, save for the occasional groan of a wounded hunter or the soft padding of wolves moving through the wreckage. The fight was over. Kael stood in the center of it all, his breath steady but his heart pounding with the weight of what had just transpired. He had spared the leader of the hunters, proving he was not the monster they believed him to be. But would that mercy be enough? Would they finally leave the pack in peace? Leora came to stand beside him, her fur matted with blood, not all of it her own. "We did it," she murmured, her voice hoarse but steady. "We won." Kael looked around at the faces of his pack. Some were exhausted, some were injured, but all of them stood tall, victorious. He turned his gaze to his father, who studied him with something unreadable in his eyes. "You could have killed him," Eldrick said. It wasn't a challenge, nor a rebuke, just an observation. Kael nodded. "I could have." He met his father's gaze. "But I won't become what they think I am." Eldrick exhaled, a slow nod of approval following. "Then you are wiser than most." A movement in the trees made Kael tense, but it was just one of their own, a scout returning. "The hunters that survived are gone," the wolf reported. "They're retreating into the valley." Relief swept through the pack, but Kael knew better than to celebrate too soon. "They'll come back one day," he said. "Maybe not now, maybe not for years. But they will." Eldrick crossed his arms. "Then we will be ready." Kael felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. He had spent so long resisting his destiny, fearing the role he was meant to play. But now, as he looked at his pack, he knew there was no escaping it anymore. "I'll protect them," he vowed, more to himself than anyone else. "No matter what comes next." Leora stepped closer, pressing her forehead lightly against his shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone," she whispered. Kael closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her presence, the quiet strength in her words. No, he wasn't alone. He never had been. As the blood moon began to set, giving way to the first light of dawn, Kael took one last look at the land they had fought so hard to protect. A new era was beginning. And this time, it belonged to the wolves.